All right, y'all. We're gonna just get started here. Um, just wanted to, thank everybody for joining us tonight for our second event of the year. We have more events to come, and hope you all will continue to join us as we host guest speakers presenting on a range of topics covering the history of class struggle in Virginia and beyond. Our goal as a Virginia worker is to build a distinctly pro-worker and independent ideological pole of attraction for the Virginia working class, which otherwise does not exist. Our editorial board is comprised of groups across the state who emphasize organizing workers independently from capitalist parties and their auxiliary organizations, which promote a class collaborationist agenda to the detriment of Virginia workers. Our website is meant to popularize the struggles, campaigns, reports, and debate across the state. And we welcome all contributions that fall in line with our mission statement, which you can find at thevirginiaworker.com. Tonight's guest is Professor Ahmed White, who teaches labor and criminal law at the University of Colorado Boulder and is the author of Under the Iron Heel, The Wobblies and the Capitalist War on Radical Workers, which won the International Labor History Association Book of the Year. He's also the author of The Last Great Strike, Little Steel, the CIO, and the Struggle for Labor Rights in New Deal America. Before we get started, I just want to say Professor White will be presenting, and then after his presentation, we'll open it up to question and answer period. If you have a question, we ask that you type it in the chat box, and we'll read them off as they come along. And without further ado, we'll pass it on to Professor White.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here this evening, and I'm honored that you asked me to talk about my book, Under the Iron Heel. So I will spend a few minutes, sometime, maybe 40 minutes, 45 minutes, talking about the book, what it says, where it originated, what I think are its implications. And I'm very much looking forward to whatever questions you might have about it, comments, that sort of thing. The book is called Under the Iron Heel, and that raises, I think, for many people, an interesting question at the very outset. Where did you get that title? Well, many of you probably are familiar with a similar title, a book called The Iron Heel, by Jack London. Yes, Jack London, the writer of White Fang, The Call of the Wild, To Build a Fire, and so forth. The book didn't start out with that title, but long before I finished it, it was evident I had to call it that. And not just because it's catchy or whatever, but because there is a backstory here, and it appears to some extent in the text of the book. And that's to do with the connection between Jack London and the main subject of the book, the industrial workers of the world, or the IWW, or the Wobblies. So Jack London wrote this novel called The Iron Heel. It was serialized, but I think it came out in 1909. And what it does is tell a dystopian story, kind of a warning about a radical uprising, an uprising of workers that is brutally suppressed, setting the stage for centuries of tyrannical, authoritarian, oligarchic rule. This book was, in fact, a main inspiration for Orwell, and is one of the great dystopian novels of the 20th century. Now, it also was quite influential. If you've not read it, it kind of functions as a bit of a primer on socialist theory. It's, I think it's written in an intentionally sort of overwrought style. Jack London could actually write quite well by any conventional measure. In this instance, he doesn't, or at least he writes in a way that intentionally deviates from the accepted norms of good writing in order to better advance the thesis of the book and the feel about it. But the book, again, functioned as an introduction to socialist thought. It influenced a great number of famous socialists, among them people like Harry Bridges, the great West Coast labor leader. Leon Trotsky thought it superb, an important event in the history of socialist literature. But here's the thing about the Iron Heel and the IWW. it's very clear that the early history of the IWW influenced Jack London to write the book. And it's also very clear that the book itself, along with Jack London more generally, played a crucial role in influencing the IWW. And so in that light, it seemed impossible not to take the opportunity to name the book after Jack London and to include Jack London in the story. He was never a member of the Union himself, but he was, as the IWW put it upon his death, an IWW man. He shared with them some very important judgments about the state of the world, about the nature of capitalism in the state, including a very skeptical view especially towards the end of his life, a very skeptical view of the value of conventional politics, the value of participating in the legal system. And likewise, he was probably the most famous person to endorse the IWW's celebrated and faithful support for sabotage. And so there is this very close nexus between Jack London and the IWW. That's why I ended up calling the book Under the Iron Heel. The IWW, as they put it themselves, in the union's newspapers and other publications, very often perceived itself to be under the iron heel or beneath the iron heel. All right. So with that, the book is a history of the IWW, and more specifically, a history of the repression that the IWW faced. And it is a book about the role that repression played in essentially destroying that organization as a functional union in the period between this country's entry into the First World War in 1917 and the mid-1920s, by which time it ceased to be a functional labor union. Now, to tell that story, of course, I have to tell the story of the IWW. Some of you know it fairly well, some don't. This union was formed in the summer of 1905 by an array of leftists of various stripes, many of them socialists, some of them anarchists, many of them prominent in the labor movement. Some of the more famous founders included Eugene Debs, as well as the man who would, for most of this period, lead the union, William Big Bill Hayward. They were among its founders. There were others who played a significant role. There also were not so radical people, industrial unionists of some kind or another, who were interested in forming the organization. But the union itself was radical in its ambitions and in its aims and purposes and methods from the very outset. You can go online easily and pull up copies of its preamble. It's the preamble to its constitution, including its original preamble, which made all of that clear. Its stated goal was to topple capitalism. And interestingly, to do so by a very simple method. The idea was to organize the entire industrial working class. And then once that was accomplished, to call one big strike that would bring the capitalists to their knees, force them to surrender the means of production, and in that way set the stage for the creation of a workers' commonwealth that would replace capitalism once and for all. That was the idea. It was very, very simple in its conception. As the founders of the union knew, though, it wouldn't be simple to actually execute this plan. They anticipated from the outset that they would meet with tremendous repression, that they would feel the full force of the power of the capitalists and their control of the state. Another important feature of the organization when it was formed was its skepticism about the state and about the political process. This was a major issue of contention among socialists and leftists in the early 20th century, whether to participate in what were called parliamentary procedures or not. The IWW came out on the side of not participating in those procedures. That became clearer and clearer in the first 10 years of the union's existence. It staked out that position that created a wedge between it and many conventional socialists, including Eugene Debs, who, unlike some socialists, remained a friend and supporter of the IWW, but he became more and more distant from the union and the union's doings, in part because of a different view about participating in so-called parliamentary politics. As many of you know, Debs continued to run for president as the Socialist Party candidate, including in 1918 when he was in prison, having been convicted of violating the Espionage Act. I'll talk about that in just a little bit. The union in its first few years struggled to find its footing. It didn't seem to have a clear vision of how it would go about organizing the industrial working class. It proved fairly adept, fairly capable of interjecting itself into labor disputes that were already unfolding, taking control of them and managing them pretty well. It did this in a few really celebrated strikes. There was the so-called press car strike in McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania in 1909. There was the Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912, and in the textiles industry, and the next year in Paterson, New Jersey, also in textiles. In all of those cases, and many others, the union proved pretty good at taking the leadership of strikes among workers who it had not, before this labor dispute erupted, effectively organized. What it was not so good at doing was maintaining the support of these workers. It would sign up hundreds, sometimes thousands, in a couple of cases, in the cases I just mentioned, as many as 10 or 15,000 striking workers. But within months or a year or so, most of those had drifted away. This left the IWW by the early 19-teens on the verge of irrelevancy, if not complete collapse. What saved it from that fate was a recognition among some of its members, including Bill Hayward, who I mentioned, and another figure some of you have heard about, Frank Little, that the union was well positioned to organize migratory workers, mostly west of the Mississippi River. It took a while for this plan to come into execution, but by 1915, 1916, the organization was making headway, particularly among agricultural workers, and most particularly among agricultural workers in the so-called Wheat Belt, a vast strip of land running from North Texas to Texas and Oklahoma panhandles, all the way up into the Canadian prairie provinces, where the main crop grown was wheat. And at the time, the industry was not particularly well mechanized, and that was especially true of the harvest, which required seasonally tens of thousands of workers to come in there and to help bring in the harvest, to cut the wheat, to shock it and all that, thresh it, all of that. The union began to organize these workers, and it was very successful at doing that. Part of the reason it was successful is that it also innovated its organizing methods. It developed something called a job delegate system, where instead of there being some organizers stationed here and there across the country who would wait for workers to come to them and say, hey, I want to be an IWW or Wobbly, this new idea was to essentially deputize workers themselves, send organizers among these migratory workers, people who would work alongside of them, and not only organize them, but also negotiate with employers. In this instance, in small grain agriculture, in the Wheat Belt, as it was called, this meant the farmers. to organize with, to negotiate with the farmers the daily rate that these workers would be paid. And this was really quite ingenious because it was flexible. It earned the union credibility because the organizers worked right alongside the people that they were organizing. And it was effective at actually improving the conditions that these people worked under. So this was a revolutionary organization, but it was also committed to improving the day-to-day conditions under which these people labored. So once this job delegate system was put fully into effect in the 1916 harvest season, the union began to organize workers, to recruit workers in significant numbers. This had a kind of cascading effect because this success in organizing workers increased the flow of dues, and with these revenues generated by dues, the union was then able to expand its organizing efforts, expand publication of union publications to send organizers into other reaches. And already by 1916, this agricultural workers union was recruiting other migratory workers in other industries who took out union membership in this agricultural affiliate of the IWW. Most notably, this was true in the timber industry in the Pacific Northwest and in the Great Lakes region. And so by the end of 1916, the IWW had been saved from irrelevancy and was moving forward with a plan to create even more affiliates, not just for timber or lumber, but likewise in construction, in oil, and maritime shipping. What abetted this success on the union's part was the war. The wartime economy had pulled the country's economy out of recession. It cut off immigration from Europe. That created labor shortages alongside increased demand for all of these things that the union was producing. And likewise, I neglected to mention this was true in mining as well. And so by the late 1916, early 1917, the IWW was really making significant advances. And that is what contributed to the main theme in this story, the repression that the union encountered. The larger it got, the more threatening it got to the interest and social vision of powerful Western capitalists. Now, what also framed the union's fate was this business I mentioned earlier when I talked about Jack London, sabotage. Around 1910, the union's publications began to celebrate sabotage. There's a debate to this day as to what exactly the IWW meant when it invoked the concept of sabotage. Did it mean sabotage, as most of us would understand that term today, actually destroying things, and most particularly destroying the means of production? Or did it mean something different? Did it mean, as the union sometimes put it explicitly, striking on the job? Did it mean working slowly, working in strict conformance with how the boss initially ordered you to do the job, being inefficient? Well, again, there's still a debate today about what the union meant. I would say this, that primarily when the IWW invoked the concept of sabotage, it meant this business of inefficient work, but not always. There were episodes when IWWs engaged in actual sabotage. How often that occurred, who knows? But it didn't really matter, because as you can imagine, it was very easy for the union's enemies, especially when it began to gather strength, to use this charge of sabotage to justify repression against the union. What happened later in 1917, of course, the United States entered the First World War. And that created a perfect set of circumstances by which these Western capitalists could set in motion a plan to destroy the IWW, and to do so in the name not of class interest, of greed, of hostility to unions as such, but in the interest, in the name of national security, of public safety, of protecting the country from a dangerous, seditious force in its midst. And that defines the history of anti-IWW repression as it took hold in 1917. So what happened here? What did this repression consist of? Well, a few different things that all converged together. One of these was vigilantism. The union already was dealing with this. Many workers had been dealing with this. This was a fact of life in America during this period. In the fall of 1960, in a celebrated incident in Everett, Washington, a whole boatload of IWWs was attacked by a group of about 200 sheriffs, deputies, and townspeople, many of them some of the more respectable people in the town. What had happened was the union was trying to organize shingle workers in that town. It's north of, on Puget Sound, north of Seattle. And they had been run out of town several times. This was a common thing for IWWs to be run out of town, beaten up and run out of town. Well, this was an organization of people who were not easily deterred. And so their response was, well, we'll come back with even more IWWs. They did that. They arrived in this town that day with about, on a boatload of them rather, on a ferry, about 200, 250 of them. And waiting for them were these 200 armed vigilantes and police who opened fire on this boat and killed as many as 10 or maybe more people. Nothing happened to them, but in a display of something that was often the case for union people, not just IWWs, it was the IWWs who were prosecuted for this, and they narrowly avoided going to prison on murder charges. Why? Because some of the people who attacked them were killed. Maybe they had even shot themselves in the course of this. But this kind of vigilantism was already underway. Usually it didn't involve people getting killed, but it often involved vicious beatings, often involved people being deported from a town or a county, or in one celebrated incident in the summer of 1917 in Bisbee, Arizona, more than 1,000 striking miners, many of them immigrants, among them Mexican immigrants and also Mexican Americans, deported from Arizona across the state line into New Mexico at gunpoint and never permitted to come back to that town again because they were trying to organize, because they were actually on strike, and the strike was being led by the IWW. And so this was a common feature of the repression that began in, that didn't begin, but it became very common, increasingly intensive in the late, in 1917, late 1916 into 1917. Another kind of repression the union faced was prosecution for something called criminal syndicalism. What's criminal syndicalism? Well, criminal syndicalism laws were mainly state laws. Some of them were local municipal laws, but they were mainly state laws. They were felonies, meaning they allowed people to be pretty severely punished by as much as 10 or 15, in some cases 20 years in prison. And what they did was make it a crime to advocate or be a member of an organization that advocated what was called political or industrial change by means of crime, sabotage, or other kinds of violence. This was tailor-made to prosecute the IWW. And the beauty of it was that you didn't have to have actually employed these means to try to bring about a revolution. You didn't have to have actually engaged in violence or sabotage. You didn't even have to have advocated sabotage or that kind of thing. All you had to do was be a member of an organization that was said to have advocated using these means to bring about revolutionary change. So to convict someone of criminal syndicalism, all that police and prosecutors had to do was show that they were members of the IWW and then put the IWW on trial and say, and they usually did this with some kind of snitches or turncoats from the union, as well as union literature that they selectively mined or filtered to find the most extravagant and bombastic statements, to put the union on trial and say, look, the union is advocating violent revolution. This guy's a member of the union, therefore he is guilty of criminal syndicalism. It worked like a charm. The first of these statutes was enacted in Idaho at the behest of a bunch of timber capitalists. The second such law was enacted in Minnesota. Also, timber and mining interests played a key role. And within a couple of years, about 20 states had felony criminal syndicalism laws. All of these states, or just about all of these states, were states where the IWW was active. And before all was said and done, a couple of hundred, not a couple of hundred, 500 or 600 IWWs were prosecuted for criminal syndicalism. Another thing that was used to undermine the union was a law that you may have heard of because it's still on the books and still being used against political dissidents. That's the Federal Espionage Act. So you think, well, espionage means spy. Well, there were provisions of the law that kind of had to do with spying, but not all of them concerned spying, and the provision used against the IWW didn't. What it did was make it a crime to interfere with the war effort. And what happened to the IWW, this was a federal law. The federal government, pressed by powerful Western capitalists, charged about 200 IWWs with undermining the war effort. How did they supposedly undermine the war effort? By launching strikes in the western reaches of the country during the war. Now, there's another wrinkle on this. The charges that were laid against these IWWs under that statute were conspiracy charges. In order to be guilty of conspiracy, you do not have to have done the thing that you're said to have conspired to do. You only have to have agreed with others to try to do it. And that's pretty much it. And so these people were brought to trial, most of them in 3 big show trials. One in Chicago, the first one in Chicago in 1918. The next one in 1919 in Sacramento, California, and the third one in Kansas City, Kansas. In every one of these cases, dozens. In the Chicago case, about 100 IWWs were brought to trial on the theory they had conspired to undermine the war effort by a campaign of strikes. And they getting brought in these turncoats or snitches. They brought in so-called experts talking about interpreting for the jury this IWW literature. See, that proves how violent these people are, how seditious they are, how much they're in league. And this was really effective. They were supposedly in league with the Kaiser's Germany in trying to bring down America and undermine the war effort. Most of these people were convicted, and most of them were sent to federal prison, in most cases to Leavenworth. And much of the union's leadership, in fact, most of the union's leadership was convicted in these Espionage Act cases. This wasn't all, though. Tens of thousands of IWWs were arrested and prosecuted for vagrancy during this period. What's vagrancy? Well, in short, vagrancy is whatever some cop or police judge or some other kind of judge decided vagrancy was. These vagrancy laws were, and they still are, very, very broadly worded, and they permitted people to be prosecuted simply on the word of the police, that they were dissolute, that they were dangerous radicals, that sort of thing. These are misdemeanor laws, almost all of them. So the amount of time you'd serve in jail was not that significant. But in a way, that was an advantage, because the less time you face, the less jail time you face when you're charged with a crime, kind of the less due process rights you're entitled to. So it made it very easy to convict people and to convict them very quickly. of vagrancy. And so vagrancy served as a kind of a widespread, a measure that could be used very expeditiously across much of the country. Didn't need elaborate procedures to convict people or arrest them. Local sheriff would just pick people up, drag them to the police station. Sometimes it was a police judge, a police court judge who just ruled right there on the spot. In the IWW, guilty of vagrancy, 10 days in jail, 30 days in jail, or get out of town, or we're going to put you in jail, or get out of town. And you remember I mentioned earlier these job delegates who are going around organizing people. Well, you're organizing people, you're going to have what, dues money on you and membership books. Give us that, and then get out of town. Steal your money, get the membership list, and get rid of the organizer. This was done countless thousands of times to IWWs during this period. The upshot of all of this is that this campaign took its toll on the union. So one of the things I try to argue in the book, because I think this has not been the subject of enough attention by scholars, is to show just how it was that this kind of repression broke the union. And the main theme here for me is the human toll that this took, especially the prison sentences that these union people served. Some of them served as long as 6 or more years in prison. A few were framed for murder. I mentioned vigilantism. Well, in another celebrated incident in 1919 in Centralia, Washington, an IWW, a group of IWWs had unsuccessfully or had attempted many times to establish a union hall in the town. They were several times run out of town, beaten up, that sort of thing. A couple of them were prosecuted for criminal syndicalism and thrown in prison. In the spirit of the IWW, they didn't give in. They persisted in trying to establish themselves in that town. They finally opened a union hall, another union hall there. They got word that these vigilantes, many of whom were American legionnaires, were going to try to run them out of town again on Armistice Day. So they went to talk to a lawyer, a local lawyer who was sympathetic to them and whose brother was an IWW member, and asked him, you know, do we have the right to defend ourselves? The lawyer said, well, yes, you do. He says, maybe you should talk to the police first. And they tried, and the cops told them, well, we can't do anything. So they armed themselves, and when these vigilantes tried to storm their union hall, they opened fire on them and killed several of them. One of their own number was captured and lynched. And then a number of them, 10 of them, were put on trial for murder. 10 of the IWWs were put on trial for murder, and most of them convicted and sent to prison. The last one of those didn't get out of prison until the late 1930s. So all to say that some of these people served very long prison terms. Even the ones who served a couple years, that's not nothing. And that's a point I try to make in the book. This was devastating. The conditions they endured, the humiliation, the loneliness, the frequency with which they were subjected to solitary confinement in prison, locked up in dungeons, the horrible food they had to eat, the terrible labor they had to do in prison, the separation from their family and loved ones. This is the way repression did its work. The point was to break them, and many of them were broken. Even though the kind of courage they showed was quite unbelievable. But everyone has a limit. And it was not only these IWWs themselves who were broken or deterred from further activism in the union, it was anyone else who might have an interest in the organization. They saw what the purpose of this was, or what these punishments, to send a lesson to them. If you take out the union's red membership card, this is what can happen to you. And this proved, I think, extremely detrimental to the organization and its organizing efforts. And why wouldn't it? When these were the costs that were extracted from people who wanted to organize themselves. Also, this kind of thing had a disruptive effect. At one point, essentially all of the union's leadership was locked up. They couldn't run the organization anymore. Any organization is vulnerable to that kind of thing, and the IWW was no exception. On top of that, this kind of repression had financial costs. Many times these union members didn't bother to put on a legal defense. They regarded it as futile, and they were generally right. Actually, this contributed to a schism in the union between those who thought legal defense was a useful undertaking and those who thought it was a waste of time. But there were enough who thought this was worth doing that it cost a lot of money. I'm talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to represent these workers at a time when that was an awful lot of money. The union also paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in bail money, much of which it never got back. This took a great toll on a union that was composed not of wealthy workers, but of some of the country's poorest workers. And that too helped undermine the organization. And then the other thing I say in the book is all these prosecutions confirmed in the minds of many people in the public the very thing that they took for granted when they were launched against the union in the first place, which is that this was a dangerous, seditious organization. It wasn't, but the more these prosecutions piled up, the more everyday people who didn't know better assumed that, yeah, the union must be dangerous. It must be seditious. It needs to be punished and restrained. The end result was that repression helped break the organization. This is a point I make explicitly in the book. It wasn't the only factor in the union's demise. There were other things going on. One was the rise of the communist movement. The communist movement in this country was born in the summer of 1919, and it appealed to the IWW to join in what was called a Comintern, or the Communist International. The IWW initially flirted with accepting this request. This was coming from Moscow, from the Bolsheviks, but it ultimately decided that its worldview, its revolutionary ideology was too different than the Bolsheviks. It didn't believe in state power. It was a syndicalist organization with an element of anarchism about it. And it also didn't trust the Bolsheviks. And it was probably right not to trust the Bolsheviks. They thought, the IWWs, that the Bolsheviks would take them over and maybe force them at some point to merge with conventional labor unions, AFL unions. That's probably right. The other way the communists undermined the IWW was by peeling off members. So a number of prominent IWWs joined the Communist Party during this period, including Big Bill Hayward, who had fled to the Soviet Union to escape. He was out on bail to escape further imprisonment for violating the Espionage Act. The union had other problems on top of this. It never was the best organized entity, and the repression didn't help with that. But repression, again, I argue, was a key factor in the organization's demise. I mean, whatever one thinks about whether these other factors would have eventually done in the IWW, my argument is that no organization could have survived what the IWW endured in the way of repression alone. And I add to that, or would add to that, also that repression remained a fact of life for the IWW whenever and wherever it remained a viable organization. The repression only ended when and where the union had been driven into irrelevance. At that point, the union's enemies relented, not before then. And that tells you something about the purposes of repression, as well as its consequences and its effects. Now, I mentioned that at the beginning, Jack London and the iron heel. Well, one of the great ironies of this story is that the IWW, as well as Jack London, in the years after the union was formed, kind of prophesied what would happen to the organization? They would be subjected to tremendous repression. The IWW and Jack London both took the view that the state would be their implacable enemy, that the law would not count, due process and all these other, the First Amendment, all these great constitutional guarantees wouldn't count for anything or almost nothing when it came to persecuting them. Well, the great irony of the IWW story is that by the union's own demise, they proved that they were right about that. By what happened to them, they proved that their prophecy and Jack London's prophecy about the nature of the state, the nature of the law, the capitalist society was fundamentally correct. They said they would destroy you, and they did. And that is, again, a central irony in the union's history and the union story. And that takes me to, I guess, the last major point I want to make before we open it up for conversation and questions. And that is to do with the legacy of this experience. I think there is an enduring lesson here about the state, about the legal system, and about the folly of relying on law and the state as a revolutionary organization of the sort that the IWW was. A lot has changed since the 19-teens and 1920s. There is no doubt about that. But what has not changed is that we still live in a capitalist society. Jack London famously said that, and I quote him in the book to this effect, power is the arbiter. Not sentiment, not political principle, not legal principle. At the end of the day, power is the arbiter. And in a capitalist society, by definition, the power is vested in the hands of the capitalist. And they will use that power at the end of the day to advance their interest and their social vision. And that's not to say that reform never matters or amounts to anything, but it is to say that one would be, I think, unwise not to anticipate that this sort of fate is liable to await revolutionaries even today. That, to me, is the single most important lesson in the IWW's experience. There are other lessons here about fortitude, about courage, about solidarity, all of which are evident in extraordinary degrees in the IWW story and its experience. But so too is this lesson, this enduring lesson about the power of the state and about the follies of relying on the state, of trusting in its pretenses. And likewise, and I guess this would be the last point, of trusting in the support of liberals and progressives who, as I argue in the book, played a crucial role in leading the destruction of the organization. There's more that I say in the book, a lot more. There's stories about the lawyers who represented these people who were, as a rule, sacrificial and courageous and committed themselves. There's lots about the way these prosecutions played out. There's lots about the work these people did and how that influenced them. And there's a fair bit about who these people were in the IWW, not just the kind of work they did, but where they were from and where they ended up. But I'll leave it at that and look forward to some questions and comments about this story.
Thank you so much, Professor White. Yeah, so if folks have any questions, just start typing them in the chat box. We'll read them off as they come in. Just off the top of my head, I'm wondering what made you want to cover this history and in this topic in the first place, like, dedicating this time to writing a book on all this.
So, yeah, I've been asked that a few times, and I guess I have a number of different answers. I won't give you all of them. But one of them is to do with my own upbringing. I was raised by a father who grew up on a dirt poor on a cotton farm, picking cotton. And unlike a lot of people who had that experience, he developed a lifelong affinity for that kind of work. He always worked hard. He made sure we worked hard on a farm. And so I did that work coming up. I still do to some extent. And I was surrounded by people who worked that way. And to me, that gave me, as a Marxist would say, a sense of the dialectic of the thing, not just the horrible properties of work, the way it can be crushing and exploitative, but likewise the dignity of it. And so as I sort of began to establish myself as a scholar and develop an initial interest in the IWW, the thing that most intrigued me was this harvest labor and the people who did that work. And it kind of went from there. And I also think that my interest in this, for sure, was driven by my role as a law professor and someone who has had doubts all of my career as a lawyer and a law professor about law, about its true nature, its value, its meaning. And as I mentioned at the end of my presentation, the IWW are one of history's best tests of what the law really means. And so this story has intrigued me for 20 years or more. And I finally, after I wrote the book about Steele, I had the time to write this story, and I took that opportunity, and that's what led to this book.
Mike asks, well, he says first, you mentioned that no organization could have survived the tremendous repression leveled by the state, but was there anything they could have done to be more resilient or at least regroup after the war?
It's not clear to me they could have. I have the sense that had they gotten stronger, I mean, they certainly could have made the better decisions in organizing. I mean, you could always do that. They could have been more focused in their work in all of these industries. I mentioned how they expanded from agriculture to mining, to timber and construction and oil and maritime shipping. They were always best in agriculture. They weren't as well organized in these other industries, so they could have recruited more workers on those fronts. But it's not clear that that would have made much of a difference. Some critics of the union argue that they could have been less fatalistic, more reasonable about in facing repression. That's true, but it raises the question: would they have still been the same organization had they given up that kind of fatalistic elan, or whatever you want to call it? And there's also a question: would they have been much more successful? The reformist unions, left-leaning but still reformist, that were at the core of the CIO's organizing successes in the late 1930s and into the 1940s, faced the same kind of backlash in some ways that the IWW did. So, given the fact that their persecution might have been justified with arguments about them being violent or destructive or seditious, but at root had to do with the economic interest of these powerful capitalists, it's not clear in that way that acting any differently would have preserved them from repression. They hadn't organized themselves maybe as successfully as they could have, but they hadn't faced the worst repression that they could have faced. They put hundreds of them in prison. They could have put thousands, and I don't think there was any real impediment to that.
Yeah, John just wanted to add the point that the IWW still exists today and is still organizing workers.
It is, and it's what it's doing good work, and some of what it's doing is brave. But I don't mean to undermine it or what it's done. But the real test of whether it's returned to the level of whether it's recaptured what the organization had a century ago, sad to say, the test of that will probably end up being when and whether they start throwing them in prison again. Because I think that's in the offing. I don't say that to be facetious, and I certainly don't wish that fate on anyone, but I think that's the way this society works. You trample on the interests of really powerful people in significant ways, and they have a way of throwing you in prison.
Yeah, for sure. And definitely different time period too. I mean, as someone who has tried to organize through the IWW, I don't know, it seems like the sentiment of workers at that period were more open to IWW propaganda, and there was just the Russian Revolution had happened, right? So this idea of a socialist reality seemed much more tangible than today, where I think people generally are much more kind of nihilistic or jaded about the possibility of something like that. And then not to mention, like you were saying about like what were the alternatives? Well, the only other alternative I could think is, well, either you successfully do like what the Bolsheviks did, or like funny enough, like the Communist Party, they were very militant and revolutionary in their orientation in the beginning, and then you have like them slowly responding to like the repression, and then also like the deals between Stalin and FDR, where then all of a sudden they become kind of like pro-American, like Earl Browder, all that stuff, and Popular Front, like they actually end up kind of championing the U.S. capitalist state because it's anti-fascist or something.
Oh, that's right, and that leads to an important point, just in terms of things one can learn from the IWW's experience. The IWW's antipathy to the state wasn't just tactical. It wasn't just based in a mistrust of the state. It was based in a kind of antipathy to some of the things that are facts of life in the world today, and that many other kinds of leftists embrace, including the welfare state, which in some ways has bought workers off, has taken the edge off of modern capitalism. The IWW didn't believe in that. It rejected the welfare state. So we don't want to be bought off by you. We want to take control of the means of production ourselves. You keep your welfare money. We don't want that. Now, I'm not saying that's the right approach. I'm not saying that's the wrong approach, but it's a different approach than what has come to predominate in much of the industrial world today. And that I think plays some role in quieting the militant impulses of the working class. So I think that is part of what's going on here.
Yeah, so you mentioned like there was a schism within the IWW over the question of like legal defense and legal work. I didn't know how much of that was tied to like, say, the International Labor Defense, because Big Bill Haywood was the co-founder of the ILD, largely funded through the Bolsheviks and the Comintern. So I don't know if it was in relation to that or something prior to that.
Yeah, that was part of it. The union played a key role with, as you point out, with the communists informing the ILD. It was broader than that, and it had in part to do with Haywood's absconding to Russia, from which he never returned. It also had to do with tactical questions and questions about, the earlier question, could the union have done things differently? So by the early 1920s, there were two main kind of structures within the IWW, two prominent affiliates within the union that exercised an outsized influence. One was the agricultural union, something called the AWIU, the Agricultural Workers Industrial Union. The other was the lumber workers affiliate, the Lumber Workers Industrial Union. They had somewhat different outlooks. The agricultural union was the more conventional. It believed more in sound business practices, you might call it, in running the union, at least in part, like a conventional organization. It believed more in legal defense, in mounting effective legal defenses, hiring lawyers, not being so fatalistic about these cases. It was a little bit more sympathetic to the Bolsheviks. The Lumber Workers Union was different in all those respects. It was more true to the union syndicalist legacy. It was more hostile to legal defense, more hostile to the communists, more indifferent to the idea of running the union in a somewhat more business-like fashion. And the schism played out substantially along those lines. And in 1924, 1925, it tore the union apart. And it was, again, aggravated by the repression the organization faced. Every organization can deal with internal problems better when it isn't also facing an existential threat, when its leaders aren't being hounded, thrown in prison, and its potential recruits frightened, threatened with the idea of imprisonment or beatings or even death.
Yeah, I guess sort of to piggyback off that, Mike was asking, if you think having something like an IWW version of the ILD, which used court cases as mobilizing tools and causes in the 30s, could have emerged at that time.
Maybe. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, it's an interesting question, because there is a different side to persecution. It does radicalize people, as I mentioned. This proved the IWO is right. You want to see which side the state is on? Look at the criminal syndicalism laws. Look at the Espionage Act. Look at all this vigilantism that goes unpunished. Look at all of this. The problem is, yeah, I can help radicalize people, but at the cost of also undermining the organization. It's interesting, though, to think what role the demise of the IWW played in contributing not only to the rise of the Communist Party as a main pillar of industrial union organizing in the 30s, but the rise of its different model, which is, as you pointed out, was one that very quickly culminated in reformism and compromise, including with the CIO, the whole Popular Front movement in the 1930s. You know, you can't make a definitive argument about that, but it's hard to imagine that happened without some influence, without the experience of the IWW being an influence. If you go it alone, if you're true to your radicalism, will bury you. If you make compromises with the right people, you have a chance to make some organizational inroads, as communists did within the structure of the CIO in the 1930s, in the Popular Front period.
We have Wobbly, who's sort of commenting and asking a question in relation to what we've just been sort of talking about between that period and the receptiveness of IWW ideas amongst workers versus now. So they're just saying, you know, like, that they were stunned the COVID experience didn't make more workers ready to try something new. And they're wondering, like, is this cultural somehow to our time, or a changing national makeup, or is the IWW still too radical, or maybe our history is holding us back?
Well, one thing that's holding you back is the law, as you know, and not just the law that, well, we'll put you in jail if you do some of these things or even talk about them. That could happen. These laws are more limited in their enforceability, mainly by a Supreme Court case 54 years ago, Brandenburg versus Ohio, where the Supreme Court said in a criminal syndicalism case involving, in this instance, a Klansman, but it said something that's applicable beyond some pathetic Klansman. It said that in order to prosecute people for revolutionary activism, or any kind of seditious type crime, you have to show that the danger that you're guarding against was imminent and really kind of intended by the person who was arguing it. That made it impossible to prosecute people in the way that they were being prosecuted back in the day. So that's one respect in which, oh, and I should say that law is under a lot of pressure from liberals who want to overturn it. So they can do what? Supposedly prosecute a bunch of Trump people. Probably they do want to prosecute some Trump people. But if that law is overturned, there's nothing about overturning it that would limit the rule to prosecuting Trump people. You could then prosecute anybody. And it's significant in this regard that who's facing prosecution under the Espionage Act that we know of? Julian Assange. And likewise, if they ever got him back to this country, Edward Snowden. So that's one way in which the law is a fetter, but there's another way, and that's the labor law itself. The labor law by design favors conventional unions. That was the whole point of the National Labor Relations Act, to normalize, to make conventional labor unions and union activism, and to limit activism of the sort that the IWW engaged in. These, I mentioned sabotage or direct action, as the union put it more broadly. Even when the union, and usually wasn't, engaging in anything remotely destructive, it made a habit of what? Back in the day, strikes. We're going to strike anytime and all of the time. We're not going to enter into written collective bargaining agreements. Why? Because those tend to limit your ability to strike. Well, there are a number of ways in which the modern labor law makes you enter conventional written collective bargaining agreements and limits your right to strike. You engage in picketing. If it's sympathy picketing, that's a secondary boycott. We'll get an injunction on you. We'll put you in jail if you don't abide the terms of the injunction. You engage in organizing picketing to make the employer organize you. We'll either force an election or get an injunction on you for that. So there are all kinds of things in the labor law that limit the kind of activism that defined IWW activism and distinguished it from the conventional unionism that predominates today. And, these conventional unionists back 50, 70 years ago could at least say in their defense, okay, yeah, but we're delivering the bacon here. We're good. We're not revolutionaries, but we're good at representing workers, organizing workers, bringing home better benefits. There was a lot of truth to that. But nowadays, they're suffering. All of this upsurge of the last 2 or 3 or 4 years hasn't yielded any great growth in membership. And so what are you getting out of this legal program or regime? It's limiting union radicalism, militant tactics of the IWW sort, while it's not abetting many advances on the part of conventional unions. It raises a question, and I'm not the only one that raised this question. What's the good in this this system of legal regulation that arose in the New Deal and that we have today? It's a question worth asking, I think. And some people have argued for just that reason. Maybe workers would be better off without if the National Labor Relations Act were repealed. If the state labor laws were also repealed, maybe it's certainly a question worth asking, I think.
Yeah, I think with what was it, the AFSCME case that was basically trying to instill right to work on a federal level. That was one of the arguments they put forward, was that if you keep attacking the workers' rights, at a certain point, we're not going to be able to control them through this conventional unionism thing, and it might actually encourage more militancy as a result. And I think this was actually coming as a defense from the union itself. The lawyer of the union was making this argument.
That's right.
So
that's a tried and true argument going back to the 30s, when the right wing of the labor movement said, yeah, that's why we need a labor law. Need a labor law in order, or else you're going to be back dealing with these IWW types. And if not, then a bunch of communists, and not the kind who work within our framework, but the kind you can't trust. And that was a powerful argument for labor reform. It continues to be. You're quite right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we've explicitly touched on it yet, but I was wondering, in the book, does it cover how much of an influence the Russian Revolution was in terms of the state's treatment or approach of the IWW?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The Russian Revolution, which it came after the storm of anti-IWW repression was already underway. So that began late 1916 into 1917, and the revolution comes later in 1917. That certainly made the IWW's position more precarious. And it contributed to, the so-called Red Scare, where the whole kind of ethos of the day was that all of these Reds are equally, in some ways, equally dangerous. They're all in some sense in league with each other, and you bring them all down. One point I would make in that regard is that the anti-communist repression in this country that emerged with the birth of the communist movement in the summer of 1919 was initially entwined with as it was called, anti-IWWism. The communists were thought to be dangerous in significant part because they were just an extension of the IWW. That wasn't really true, but there was some truth to it. The Communist Labor Party, one of the two major parties to emerge when the communist movement was formed in the summer of 1919, did have fairly significant ties to the IWW.
Yeah, what in terms of the book, what time period are we talking here in the history of the IWW? Does it go up to the 20s or?
In the 20s, the main period of repression was the main period of IWW ascendance and activism. So from about 1916 until 1925 or so is when the union really collapsed. There was still some strikes. I cover a strike in my home state in Colorado in the fall of 1927 and the winter of 1927, 1928 coal strike. And that was the last great IWW massacre, where what's the number? I think seven or eight strikers were killed in two incidents. One in not too far from Boulder, Colorado, in Boulder County, Colorado, in November 1927, and then early the next year, a couple more people were killed in Walsenburg in the southern part of the state. But that was kind of a last gasp. There was a little more IWW activism in the building of the Hoover Dam project a couple years later. But by the late 20s, the union was spent. It really was not very active anymore.
Yeah, Jay had a question. You sort of touched on it, but they were just curious what your thoughts of the IWW are today.
You know, I say more power to the organization. You're trying to organize workers, as the union used to say, to better their conditions, and you have something in the way of a revolutionary outlook. That's good. I mean, I think only an insane person can look at the world we live in today and think that things can go on like this. We are living. One thing I try to do in the book, not only Jack London, but one thing I try to do in the book is bring into this story not only Jack London, but a number of other literary figures who were in many ways influenced by the IWW and had interesting things to say about them. And one of those was the leftist novelist, one of the great American novelists, Theodore Dreiser, the writer of An American Tragedy and Sister Carrie. And Dreiser famously said that we were living in a kind of a half world between the beast world and the civilized world. And that's true. We still have a choice to make. Are we gonna live in a world that realizes our potential as a species, or are we going to live a barbarous existence? And we're going to destroy this world and destroy the human spirit. Again, I think you have to be insane not to understand that that's where we're positioned. And organizations like the IWW today, yeah, I could quarrel with them or quibble with them, but the one thing I won't say is that they aren't possessed of a sense that we have to change this world. And that one important way to do that is by organizing the working class. That I think is, that perspective to my mind is an unqualified good.
You know, we had Joe Burns on here for one of our events, on his latest book, Class Struggle Unionism. And, you know, one of the things he really emphasized, just like you were saying, and many others I think have as well, is, you know, in order for the labor movement to really become potent again, they're just going to have to break the law. Like you're saying, like the law has just kept the working class totally dormant or, you know, submissive in a lot of ways, with the help of the mainstream unions. You know, like they, you know, 70 years of national labor relations and the type of conventional unionism that comes with that. It's like trained the workers who are in organized labor to operate according to that approach, which is, you know, contract bargaining every few years. Maybe you have a strike, but it really kind of more so resembles a typical symbolic protest where it's, you know, you're not keeping the scabs from crossing the picket line, right? You're not causing a disorderly event where you're actually being effective. You know, it's just basically like, in order to be effective with even a strike is illegal at this point. And yeah, so I mean, it just seems very daunting, and because of that too, I think a lot of IWW people, like we're very focused on trying to organize where there is no union, right? Like we're trying to organize the unorganized, and you know, like I've been chatting with another IWW member in this event back and forth about just how difficult it is to even approach these ideas to workers today. Like it's just become so foreign. And the idea of striking is seen as just too extreme, even if you are abiding by the law set forward through the NLRB, which says you have to be, respectful and you can't block entrances and you lose all your rights if you do. So yeah, it's just it definitely feels in some ways even more challenging today to try to carry forward these ideas of like the IWW than even then, and again, I guess maybe, yeah.
The book of mine, and I, of course, encourage you all to read it. But the book of mine ends on a similar note. Another literary figure who I think understood the IWW in the early 20th century as well as anyone. The guy named James Jones, who wrote From Here to Eternity, The Thin Red Line. Some of you may have seen that movie, and he really understood the Union. He talks about it fictionally in his book From Here to Eternity. And one of his characters says, and I appropriate this phrase as the title of the last chapter of the book, that the IWW, an old wobbly, he says, who was locked up in a jail, he says that Union possessed a vision we don't possess. And I think if the IWW of the early 20th century has one legacy above all else, it's that vision, a vision of something different, a vision not of more, as Sam Gompers famously put it when asked, what does labor want more, he said, but something fundamentally different. Not simply more pay, not simply better vacation and all that, but a different society. I think above all else, that's the Union's foremost legacy for people today, unionist and otherwise. And I encourage people to study the organization with that in mind. These were people who stood for something quite different. And I think when I ask myself the question, what would drive someone to endure what these people did? It wasn't a paycheck, the promise of more pay. It was the belief in something different, a different world. It was, as many of these workers put, this was a religion for them. And that showed. And I think there's something to learn from that.
Yeah, I mean, even today, it feels like, they talk about this sort of like socialist revival, right, with Bernie Sanders and everything. But even what I think is being sold along those lines, probably most prominently through the DSA, is like I would say, the original Wobblies and a lot of people to the left of them would say, well, that's not even really this vision of an alternative society anymore. It's just the New Deal repackaged again. It's a capitalism with a human face.
That's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. And
it's just like, so the idea of, it's just like we're so jaded. And I think in a large part because of, say the figure of someone like Stalin coming to define so much of what this idea of socialism is. Like people are just jaded, and also the anti-communist propaganda today. It's like, well, what do you want? You want Venezuela? You want North Korea? Is that that's your alternative, And it's just, it seems like a relatively effective ideological weapon to convince people that this is it. This is the best we got. Is like Margaret Thatcher said, there is no alternative, right?
That's right.
This is where we're at. This is all we're going to get, which is just, I guess, steady decline towards barbarism.
That's right. Well, on that note, I've just been summoned, and I probably should see what's wanted of me. But I've quite enjoyed your questions.
Well, thanks for taking the time to present and answer our questions. Really appreciate it. And we'll definitely check out the book and stay tuned for any future projects coming.
And if any of you have any questions of me, feel free to email me. I'm easy to find. And I much appreciate the opportunity to talk with you this evening.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Well, thank you.